Due to global migration movements, classrooms are culturally and linguistically diverse. In Germany, 37% of the entire student body has an immigrant background. When zooming in on this specific group, on students with immigrant background, studies showed on average, for example, that vocabulary differences exist to the disadvantage for learners with immigrant background compared to learners without immigrant background. Vocabulary, as the entirety of words, is of particular importance, as it is a prerequisite for reading, listening, and understanding spoken and written language, and is therefore highly relevant for both academic and professional success. In addition, for example, to the socioeconomic status, stereotype threat is a possible explanation for these differences in achievement. Stereotype threat occurs when an individual fears to affirm a negative stereotype about their group. As a result, the threat leads to achievement losses, although cognitive abilities are similar. Thereby, the threat can be activated implicitly through the query of group membership, for example, via the country of birth or the language spoken at home, whereas the explicit threat is administered through the direct reference to the differences in achievement between the groups. Numerous studies have shown that, for example, personal variables can mitigate or enhance stereotype threat effects in achievement situations. Regarding the mitigation of stereotype threat, people with an immigrant background can identify with both the culture of origin and the culture of residence. For example, studies have shown that a high identification with the culture of residence can lead to lower stereotype threat effects, whereas a high identification with the culture of origin and the stereotype domain, in this case reading, can lead to larger stereotype threat effects. But by now it's unclear to what extent these variables moderate stereotype threat effects in learning situations, on what we focused on in our study. Stereotype threat has been widely researched in achievement situations, but less in learning situations. Against this background, we examined in vocabulary learning situations whether elementary school children with an immigrant background show a lower vocabulary growth in an implicit and/or explicit stereotype threat condition compared to a condition without threat. In addition, we analyzed whether the identification with the culture of residence, the culture of origin, and the stereotype domain moderate stereotype threat effects in learning situations. Data for the study was collected in spring 2019 in the context of the DFG-funded project Effects and Moderators of Stereotype Threat among students with immigrant background in elementary and secondary schools. All in all, 822 elementary school students from 46 fourth grade classes from 30 schools in North Rhine-Westphalia participated in our study. As we focused on stereotype threat in the context of vocabulary acquisition, immigrant background was operationalized based on spoken family language. The analyses are based on 240 fourth graders with immigrant background who were on average 10 years old, and almost 50% were female. In a pre-post vocabulary learning design, the children were randomly assigned to the experimental stereotype threat conditions in the classroom: implicit, explicit, and the control group without threat. The learners did not significantly differ between the conditions regarding age, gender, cognitive abilities, and the amount of books in the household as an indicator of socioeconomic status. So what exactly have the children done in our study? At the beginning, they had to work on a vocabulary pretest. In this test, the children had to select, according to the target word on the left side, for example, manner, the appropriate synonym of 5 words on the right side, for example, power, hinge, style, possibility, and human. The pretest was to assess their vocabulary with regard to the text they had to read in order to learn new words in the subsequent learning units. After the vocabulary pretest, the threat conditions were administered. In the implicit condition, the children had to answer questions about their spoken language as home, as well as their and their parents' country of birth. In the explicit condition, the children were informed and read a short text that children who also speak another language than German at home have difficulties in learning new words. Children in the no stereotype threat condition did not receive any kind of threat. Instead, they had to answer questions concerning their favorite drink and meal. After the induction of the threat, 2 learning units with a synonym game and a vocabulary post-test followed in each case, in which the words of the learning unit were tested. The learning units encompassed 2 narrative texts, and each test contained the target words twice. In addition to that, the children provided information to sociodemographic data and personal factors that may moderate stereotype threat effects, and moreover, they answered a cognitive ability test. In the end, all the children were informed that they can learn as good as others and that it is sometimes harder to learn new words, especially when they are unknown and difficult. Now, to summarize, our results regarding vocabulary growth are in line with previous research. Repeated measures ANOVA showed a large effect, meaning that vocabulary growth averaged 4 words in all experimental conditions. Contrary to our expectations, there were no statistically significant stereotype threat effects in vocabulary learning situations. A possible explanation could be stereotype reactance, where the explicit threat leads to an increase in achievement. Thus, our results showed, although not significant, that in both the explicit and the implicit condition, the vocabulary growth was higher. Further, the personal factors as the identification with the culture of residence, the culture of origin, and the identification with the stereotype domain reading had no moderating effect. Summarizing, we did not find the expected stereotype threat effects of previous work. However, we yielded valuable knowledge gains in the area of vocabulary promotion and can make suggestions for further research. To corroborate the null results regarding stereotype threat effects in a learning situation, we conducted a Bayesian parameter estimation which can quantify evidence for the null hypothesis. This is because these null results are particularly important in light of the replication crisis and potential publication bias. For example, researchers have shown with respect to stereotype threat effects that there's a bias that is caused and inflated to some degree by suppressing null results and by not publishing non-significant results. An implication for research might be, with regard to worldwide migration movements, to examine more closely stereotypes referring to different migration groups, so that a threat could be administered more specifically. Further, the self-identification of the students is to be mentioned to determine the migration status, because it is possible that participants may be classified in the migration group, although they would have been self-identified as a member of the majority group. In this context, the susceptibility with stereotypes, which reflect the perceived judgment of others based on one's own ethnicity and thus experiences stereotype threat, can also be examined.